Okay, so let's see. Am I recording? I'm recording. This is a map from the Smithsonian Magazine, and I posted this URL. It's a really fantastic map, and it's interactive. And what it does, it shows the growth of slavery, or it shows how slavery moved from the Upper South, places like Virginia and the Carolinas, Maryland, but especially Virginia into Texas. So what happens to slavery is that in 1808, the U.S. abolishes the slave trade from Africa. So after 1808, it became illegal for slaves to be imported into the United States from Africa. That was part of the deal when the Constitution was written. And the reason that slaveholders were okay with this is that they knew, or they anticipated anyway, that the United States would grow and that there would be an internal market for slaves. So slaves aren't coming in from Africa anymore. But what happens is there's a surplus of slaves in places like Virginia and the Carolinas, and slaves then are sold south. They're sold into these new territories as they develop. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, later Texas. So what we know now is, and we know quite a bit about the history of slavery because slavery was a business, because human beings were bought and sold. And so there's actually kind of an astounding amount of records about slavery. Slaves were counted in census records. There's just quite a bit of information on slavery. And actually, computers have been historians' friends in this way, because we can enter in this information on slavery and we can get a better sense of it. We always had a general sense. I don't think anything has really shaken our understanding of slavery, but now we can get a better sense of it. And the thing that I want to get across in this podcast is Texas's role in this. That Texas, and I'll move this, and you can, if you can't see this on your screen, I'm posting the URL. What happens is that slavery moves from the Upper South to the Lower South and into Texas beginning in the 1820s. And so by 1860, there are just under 200,000 slaves in Texas. So Texas is part of this larger movement of about 870,000 human beings that are being forcibly moved against their will, usually tied up in what were called coddles, which were coffles, which were they were tied together and shipped on foot or sometimes on boat to the Lower South. And Texas is part of this larger national story, okay? And the other thing I want to point out, and this is Torjay's, his whole argument that Mississippi comes to Mexico, i.e. the U.S. South, tidal wave of the slave economy, crashes across the Sabine into Texas. And so by 1845, or really even by the time of the Texas Revolution, Texas is more like Mississippi than it is like the rest of Mexico. And this is a really, really important point. For most of Mexico, and Torjay talks about this, for most of the Mexican nation, slavery was completely insignificant. Actually, Mexico had its own kind of horrible unfree labor system, peonage, where workers, rural workers, often were in debt. They worked on large haciendas and they were in debt. And it was not a great system, but it was not slavery. So in most of Mexico, slavery was not an issue. In fact, Mexicans, when they became independent of Spain, they took pride in the fact that their nation was not really a nation whose economy was based on slavery, which was true of the United States. In the United States, the US economy, much of the US economy, both North and South, was based on slavery. So this is not true in Mexico, except for one part of Mexico, and that is Texas. Okay, so that's the big story here. When Austin and his fellow Anglos move into Texas, and when I say Texas, really, I'm talking about East Texas, the area east of San Antonio. West Texas wasn't really settled much at this point. It was still Indian territory, North Texas. So when I'm talking about this Texas at this point, I'm really talking about kind of the more traditional view of Texas that the Spanish had and the Mexicans, this area kind of east and north of San Antonio. So when the Anglo impresarios come in to Texas, into East Texas, and they try to persuade American colonists to come into Texas, the whole idea is that they will make Texas a Mexican state. Austin doesn't come into Texas hoping to steal Texas from the United States. Stephen F. Austin wants to make Texas work as a Mexican state, but here's the key thing. It has to be the only Mexican state in which slavery exists. Okay, so this is what Tourget is talking about. There are significant fights in Mexico about the issue of slavery. And in the Constitution of 1824, which I've talked about, but I'll mention again briefly, Mexico City punted the question of slavery to Saltillo. And Saltillo, of course, was the capital of Coahuila y Tejas. And so that's where the locus is. That's the center of the fights in Mexico about whether or not slavery will exist in Texas. Some folks in Saltillo were anti-slavery, others were pro-slavery. It's very significant to remember that Tejanos, the significant Tejanos like De Zavala and Seguin, were pro-slavery. Why? Because they want cotton. They want a bit of the cotton trade. And so Tejanos, significant and influential Tejanos, are very much part of introducing slavery into Texas in the 1820s. And what happens is by 1836, there's far more Anglos and slaves in Texas than there are Tejanos. And I'll talk about the numbers in a later podcast, but there's about 36,000 non-Indians in Texas. And of that group, maybe only 3,000 are Tejanos. The majority are Anglos, and then there are slaves as well. So again, what I want to stress here is that Texas becomes the southwestern edge of slavery, beginning in the 1820s and going all the way to the Civil War. And when I'm talking about Texas, again, I'm talking about the area basically that's east of Austin and San Antonio, because you can't grow cotton west of Austin or San Antonio because there's just not enough rain. So this map, I think, is a very, very good map of, you can see the growth of slavery, you can see it moving westward, and you can see how Texas, at the beginning of this interactive map, it's not literally not even on the map, because Texas is part of Spain and then it's part of Mexico. But beginning in 1850, Texas doesn't become part of the US until 1845, so it's not in the 1840 census. So beginning in 1850, you're starting to see the introduction of slavery into East Texas. And then by 1860, there's almost 200,000 captives, slave captives, and all slaves, of course, were captives in Texas. So the big picture here is that Texas is part of a national story, and it's part of the integration and the growth of the production of cotton, the most valuable and the most desired commodity on earth, and the labor force that was used through all kinds of threats of terror and punishment, sexual assault on women, family separation, that Texas becomes part of that world. It becomes part of the slave state or the slave states of the United States. So this is what Tourget is talking about when he titles the second section of his book, Bringing Mississippi to Mexico. Texas goes from a country in which slavery is not really that significant, and in fact, there's a lot of opposition to slavery in Mexico, to becoming part of a country where slavery is absolutely central to the economy, the United States of America. And this map here really shows that transition, which happens in a 4-decade period. It shows it very, very clearly. So if you can't see it on the screen, I advise you to take a look at it. It's a pretty cool map. Remember all the suffering that's involved in this, by the way. Remember, we're talking about human beings, forced separation from families, all the violence that's absolutely essential to slave labor. So remember that we're talking about human beings here. And you can see how Texas it goes from being part of the story of Spain and Mexico to the story of the United States.